introduction. I also want to thank Win Shin and the other organizers of the panel for agreeing to allow a retired professor to come over here. I'm often reminded of what Douglas MacArthur said about retired generals. They just fade away. And of course, that's what retired professors do too, except for one day. So one day I'm not fading away, at least I hope that's the case. The topic of my talk today is to discuss the nature of and consequences of the strategic interactions between the United States and China in recent years. And to give you a sort of synopsis of sorts about it, the purpose of my talk is to provide some context for how we think about this. In this case, mostly theoretical context, and then analyze what the outcomes are. The proposition that I work from is that we have paid far too little attention to the global system, which is both economic, political, military, etc., and its impact on the way in which great powers interact strategically. And I believe that once we think about that, we both understand the benefits of that system, but we also see the threat that is posed by the current turn of events in strategic interaction between the United States and China. So that's a kind of overview of sorts of what I'm doing here. And some of the basic propositions that I am trying to articulate are up on the screen here now. The first one, I think, is the broadest one, is that the policy discussion in the United States over US-China competition is not good. It's badly gone off track. It is simply doing bad things as opposed to accomplishing positive things. And one of the reasons for that is that the competition has been reframed by virtually everyone in the United States who's talking about it, not everyone, but almost everyone, as a zero-sum relationship. Everything the United States gains must come at China's expense, and everything China gains must come at our expense. And what that does, I think, is to ignore what is, in fact, the dominant positive sum relationship between China and the United States, which has existed for many years and continues to exist in a world of deep interdependence. I'm distressed to argue that American objectives have become to preserve at all costs regional and global primacy, to deconstruct Chinese state capitalism, and to achieve even potentially regime change in China. There are many people who believe, as with our policy in Iran, that we can accomplish that. Chinese objectives, I think probably not surprising, but still somewhat distressing, is to challenge American position of global and regional primacy. And I think that is concerning, but not surprising. And that sets us into the dynamic that we are located in now. What I think they're missing in this discussion is the negative effects of this process on the system of deep interdependence. And in fact, I believe that the outcome of this has the potential to poison US-Chinese relations for a generation. Pretty serious outcome, I think. So that's sort of some of the general points. The specific case study that I try to use to discuss this is the technology co-opetition, not competition or cooperation, but co-opetition in 5G and AI. And I believe that actually defines the real issues that exist between the United States and China and provide us with some lessons to understand what's going on. I should say that Professor Ratinsky's comments earlier this morning were ones that I will echo in many areas. I couldn't find anything to disagree with you about, so I'm a little worried about that, but I'll see what I can do on that. So the first, this is a fairly long paper, I should tell you, 28 pages, 27 pages, so there's a lot in there, and I've sliced a lot of it down, but I need to talk about some of these items, I think, to make some sense here. The first part of the paper really talks about the context in which this has happened. And I think the context can primarily be traced to the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis now of 11 or 12 years ago was one that affected both Chinese calculations and damaged American position in the world. And the combination of those two things has produced some of the outcomes here. So I believe that the Chinese leaders, as a consequence of the global financial crisis, see the United States in decline. I should also add the Iraq War was a contributing factor to this as well. They lose confidence in U.S. leadership, the capacity of the United States to manage the global system effectively. But they also see an opportunity to make new advances. And indeed, the term opportunity here is not just, oh boy, we've got a chance. It is, what do we do in a world in which its global leader is failing? What do we do? How do we deal with that? How do we protect Chinese security? I think what they did is to decide to adopt a much more assertive position in terms of advancing their own power. And these things are familiar, but I simply articulate those, I believe, as a consequence, policy changes by the Chinese as a consequence of this. An increase in techno-nationalism, the expansion of CCP control within China, increasingly authoritarian control by Xi Jinping, mercantilism and trade policy. I believe those have advanced in the last several years. They, of course, have tried to expand their position, and successfully by and large, in the South China Sea, the expansion of their position through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and in the area that I'm going to focus on, the effort to build up their advanced technology in areas like 5G and AI. I see all of those things as at least partly, and in many cases mainly, a consequence of the reactions of the Chinese to the global financial crisis. From the United States perspective, my view is that the United States has begun to rethink its China policy of engagement, which has essentially been the policy of the United States more or less for the last 30 or 40 years. And to see the problem with that policy as the Chinese failure to become more democratic and to adopt free markets at the level in which Americans believe is appropriate. Now, I happen, as you will see in this discussion, I happen to think that is a mistake to think in those terms. Nonetheless, you see this kind of justification everywhere for what the United States is doing, from people on the left and people on the right, people in the middle. So it's not surprising, I think, that has become an important feature of U.S. policy. Further, to put this in slightly more theoretical terms, the United States began to shift towards a coercive policy towards China by manipulating advantages it had in the interdependence relationship, by coercing through manipulating asymmetrical interdependence, the degree to which we had a better position in the relationship of interdependence than they did, to manipulate that and to try to coerce the Chinese. So, in what form did we do that? I think the Obama administration actually began to do that in the last years of the Obama administration with TPP. What was TPP designed to do? It was designed to show that we could create a system of economic relations in Asia based on our rules, keep the Chinese out, and the Chinese would eventually say, well, gee, we've got to be a part of this, so we'll adopt your rules. Now, I want to make a distinction between Obama's strategy and Trump's, because I see in the end, Obama's strategy is one that reinforces a system of deep interdependence. It doesn't undercut it, whereas Trump's does the opposite. So the Trump administration then adopts, after they come to power, a policy of higher tariffs to coerce, based upon the belief that somehow or other we had an advantage in that game with the Chinese, that it wanted to attack Huawei, decouple China from the United States economy, various sorts of things. I see those as system undermining, that is, undermining the system of deep interdependence, and as having overall a largely negative consequence perhaps even if they reach an agreement. Even if they reach an agreement, it may be only temporary. But I also held out the possibility that the Trump administration will turn towards policies that actually reinforce the system. I think it's unclear which way that's going to go. And again, the United States has come to emphasize the preservation of economic and military primacy by slowing or stopping China's rise. I think that is part of what Trump is trying to do. So let me talk for a couple of minutes about deep interdependence. The concept of deep interdependence is a way of analyzing a global system, a system that includes economic relations but also includes lots of other things. The nuclear relationship, for example, between the US and China is one of deep interdependence, I argue. But the more important proposition from our perspective is the global system affects what great powers want to do and how to do it. That is, it affects the strategic interaction that they engage in. How do they interact with each other when they're trying to get what they want? A system of deep interdependence pushes great powers to do certain kinds of things and dissuades them from doing other kinds of things. One of the things I argue it dissuades them from doing, by and large, is manipulating asymmetric interdependence to coerce other states. It's happened some, but it doesn't happen very often. So, what is deep interdependence? I argue that it's a global system with multiple and differentiated forms of interdependence. And I'm not going to go into a lot of this because there's just too much to talk about. It's political, institutional, ideological, strategic and security, economic and financial. And probably more important, these arrangements reinforce each other. That is, there's positive feedback from the political to the economic to the military to the financial and other areas that tends to deepen and strengthen the interdependence among states. It also creates perhaps the point that I would emphasize the most. It creates a global commons for sustaining peace, global stability, and mutual economic growth. If that's right, I believe it is, of course, damaging that system could have very profound consequences. Screwing that up, which is really a product of the last 75 years, roughly my lifetime, okay, and John's. So what are the incentives from deep interdependence for strategic interaction? Well, when you get deep and complex economic exchange, it requires that you create rules and regimes, and those rules and regimes are supplied by great powers. And so where do we get all these rules that we think are important? All over the place, in finance and other places. Great powers have worked to supply those because they believe that's important. And they interact with each other strategically to produce those. So notice what's really going on here. Strategic interaction that produces cooperation to create rules. What you also find is there is very deep security interdependence. So when you have two nuclear powers, do those nuclear powers regularly march up to war and engage in war, as they did, let's say, in the 1930s, or in 1914, or in 1775? The answer is no, they do not. They engage in a competition of risk-taking, but they rarely, if ever, engage in risks of actual war. Now, that's not quite so true in the beginning of the period of the Cold War, but the turning point is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, it doesn't happen anymore. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis, it did. There's a competition and risk-taking that's going on there. So there's very strong limits on engaging in the risks of war and an emphasis on deterrence. There's no great power war for 70 years. Now, what are the examples of violating the rules here, violating, in effect, the incentives? I would use two or three, depending on what you think about. The first is the effort by the Nixon administration in 1971 to end the link between the dollar and gold and to break up the Bretton Woods system and to coerce mostly European states into doing what? and to changing the exchange rate between the dollar and their currencies. That was an effort at this. A second one was, in the 1980s, the effort by the United States to coerce the Japanese to change their policies towards investment in the United States and to change their exchange rate. Ooh, okay, 5 minutes, so I'm going to go faster. Both of those are examples, I think, of violating it. Trump is a third. A real quick point about them. What did the first two do? They required huge amounts of negotiation among great powers, which did what? It deepened deep interdependence. It strengthened deep interdependence. It didn't hurt it. Quickly on 5G and AI. I'm not going to spend really any time talking about 5G and AI. What I would talk about is 2 or 3 things. The first is 5G and AI are examples of and manifestations of deep interdependence. Deep interdependence. How is that the case? Well, both 5G and AI depend on a whole complex system of global supply chains and global production networks. And once you start pulling pieces out of it, the whole system screws up. One of the things we've learned about putting restrictions on Huawei is that we're the ones who are hurt just as much as Huawei is, because American firms supply the stuff, now they can't do that. So what you've got here is an important view. The second part is both of these require and depend on global knowledge networks. It's astonishing how many Chinese are from China in the United States learning about AI and 5G and other kinds of technologies. Now, they may go back to China, or they may go somewhere else and they stay here. Okay, I think that's an important point. So the crucial feature of this that I think is important is to understand that there are differences in the way competition on AI and 5G will proceed. 5G is primarily a standards game. And so Huawei, at least up until recently, had an interesting advantage over this. And the kind of game you're playing there is for a punctuated equilibrium of standards, changes through time, but they last for a while. AI, I think, is not like that. AI is a continuous process of competition, a continuous process of innovation. And so therefore, the United States needs the Chinese, and the Chinese needs the United States almost equally, because they're linked together in these knowledge systems that they have. So co-opetition, not decoupling, is the right thing to do. So I'll probably have 2 or 3 minutes here. Oh boy, 20 minutes goes fast. I'm going to do it in 15 minutes. Okay, so I would say that there are 4 or 5 important conclusions here. One of those is that in a world of deep interdependence, great powers will find strategies of coercion through leveraging asymmetrical interdependence, largely self-defeating. That is, it's cost us at least as much as it's cost the Chinese. Deep interdependence has that consequence. It's hard to impose cost on your adversary without imposing them on yourself. So costs are mutual. One of the other things that eventually I believe will happen, although it doesn't seem to have happened yet, is that the costs and risks to the global system will rise in salience. They'll get more and more important. People will start talking about this. I also spent some time talking about system effects, which are unwanted and unintended consequences that happen, and suggest that there are ways in which resilience of the system increases as a consequence of this process. I have spent some time talking about why I think 5G and AI are manifestations of deep interdependence, and so I think there's a point that doesn't need to be repeated again. The last point I would simply repeat again. The U.S. and China will learn that strategic coercion of each other is not effective. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of deep interdependence. It doesn't work because they risk the system of deep interdependence. Decoupling China from the United States will certainly damage China and reduce its rise. It will hurt the United States, maybe even more. So I'll stop there. Thank you.